So we are here live at CERAweek in Houston, Texas, and we have a very special guest with us today. Gin Kinney is Executive Vice President and Chief Administrative Officer at NRG Energy, where she leads marketing, communications, and customer experience. She brings more than 20 years of experience, including over a decade in the energy sector, and has played a key role in building NRG's brand and shaping a more customer-focused, digitally driven organization. She's also active in industry and community leadership with a focus on sustainability and advancing women in energy. Gin, thanks so much for joining us today.
Hey, thank you. It's great to be here.
Yeah. So one of the things from your background is you really came from, renewable energy development before joining NRG. How has that path shaped your role or what you see your role is at NRG?
Well, coming from a startup environment to a comparative behemoth, right? You definitely learn a lot on the fly in the entrepreneurial world. You definitely learn how to be scrappy, have a lot of grit, say yes a lot to challenges. You also learn how to manage things at a different scale, be really close to the customer. And I think also coming from that entrepreneurial world where you're working on project finance or you're working on project development, well, this is how we've always done it before.
Yeah.
And so I try to bring that mindset to NRG where we're much larger, but the excuse of we're not going to change or we're going to, instead of innovate or instead of take chances, we're going to protect the status quo. I think the other piece of that too is this competitive nature. When you're a startup or you're entrepreneurial, you're competing every day for dollars, you're competing for space, you're competing for customers. And when you have this highly competitive spirit, you're always playing to win.
Yeah.
And that's what we try to bring to NRG too, is that play to win, not protect the status quo.
You think that fits better in Texas with other places, given the competitive nature of the generation market in the retail space you operate in?
Texas certainly provides us the opportunity to move fast. Policy and regulators clear the pathway to get things done, get things built. And in Texas, in the competitive markets we serve, every day we have to earn the trust. We have to fight for those customers and we have to show up for them. We're not just about rate basing a solution. We have to figure out how to put that on our balance sheet and also satisfy the demands and the expectations of our shareholders.
They're also very savvy customers in Texas. I find that compared to other parts of the country, Texans really know more about their energy bills than the average American. Can you speak to that? And where do you think that comes from? Is that like a Winter Storm Uri consequence, or is that just the fact that we have this really competitive retail market?
It is. And you have to choose. When I first moved to Texas a few years ago, I had to choose my energy provider. So I had to get smart on what I was looking for, the type of services, the type of value I wanted. And certainly after Winter Storm Uri, there's a heightened sense of ERCOT. My 80-something-year-old mother who lives in Georgia knows what ERCOT is. I don't think we ever would have thought about that 5 years ago or 10 years ago,
Yeah.
right? And so that heightened sense and heightened awareness just by having to elect your energy provider. And again, in Texas, I think things are just different. We demand more, we expect more. Back to that competitive nature, sitting here with a UT grad, football is big, bright lights, I think that competitive nature comes through in kind of everything and how we operate in Texas.
Yeah, absolutely. In that space, NRG just doubled its generation fleet with a $12 billion LS Power acquisition. At the same time, you're managing a CEO transition and navigating a global energy crisis. Given all of these things happening in a hyper-competitive space, how do you prioritize, what gets your attention?
Well, as first and foremost, we do everything in service of our customers. And if we keep that in mind, all of these other issues that we see around, we always think about it from, okay, how is a CEO transition going to shape how we serve our customers? How are the changing dynamics in economic environments going to change how we provide services to our customers? If you look at it through that lens, it's easier to focus and drive towards those business outcomes than let all of the myriad of issues kind of dilute the value that we can drive across all of our stakeholders.
And I also wonder, keeping on this topic of the savvy Texas customer, we talk about things like virtual power plants and flexible demand, and people's eyes gloss over because they don't quite know what we're talking about. But NRG actually is building a 1 gigawatt virtual power plant here in Texas. Can you talk more about that and give us the details?
Well, that's enabled through the trust we built with our customers and even customers in general. So kind of taking a step back. I think customers today are so accustomed to automation. They're accustomed to letting machines decide. This is just a natural segue because we've done the hard work to build the relationships with the customers. We've talked about the value we can deliver to them. And then when we talk about savings, particularly in a time where affordability is top of mind, customers are willing to trust us with their energy usage. They're willing to enroll in VPP. We set a pretty high bar, I think, in Texas for the amount of VPP we wanted to achieve. And we more than, 5x that last year? I'm going to have to check that stat. But because that just shows that customers want what we have to offer and they value it and they trust us.
Yeah.
And who wouldn't want to ease congestion on the grid? Who wouldn't want to be a good steward of their community environment? And then bottom line, who doesn't want to save on their energy bill as other costs of the household are increasing?
Yeah, it's an interesting point to kind of bring up in terms of paying for the grid. Because, I mean, energy sits, like other Gentailers, sits in an interesting space, right? You've got the generation and you've got the retail, but not really the pieces that connect the two in between. Those are fully regulated monopolies, transmission service providers, distribution providers. And in the topic of affordability, a lot of focus is being put on electricity prices, affordability of electricity, but the large part of that that's increasing is that fixed cost system, is that transmission, the distribution costs. And so how are y'all handling that with your customers who may not fully understand that you may have 2 out of 3 of the pieces, but you're not handling the part that's actually increasing the cost the most?
At the end of the day, customers don't care.
Fair enough.
Right? They don't care. So I think it's our responsibility to partner with CenterPoint, partner with the T&D companies so that we can find comprehensive solutions to ease that pain for consumers. And if we can demonstrate savings or we can demonstrate value in other ways, you mentioned getting that closer to the customer and that dynamic. We bought a smart home company a few years ago. We did that because we knew that the closer we can get to the customer, the more we can automate and help them understand usage and look at things like, is the home occupied at this hour of the day when maybe power prices are the highest? And can we turn it down half a degree? Those are the things I think we took an extra step to think through. How can we create a very seamless, easy digital experience for the customer so that we can provide value, even though we know we don't control that one. We're only one line item on the bill, right? We're just that supply line item, both in Texas and outside of Texas. So what are the other things we can do with their whole home to help them ease that cost at the end of the day?
And is there pushback from customers? Because one thing we hear a lot is Texans don't want anyone messing with their thermostats. What have been kind of the findings from NRG as far as customer behavior, and where is that price point where customers are willing to provide some flexibility?
If we can make it so you don't feel it, that's the important part. If we're all out at dinner and we can dial down the thermostat just a little bit or dial it up depending on the season, and by the time we get home, we've pre-cooled your home or preheated your home, you didn't feel a thing, but we've managed to save you money and we've managed to ease the grid in that peak time, that it's a win-win. But we have to have the intelligent tools to do that, right? And I think that's where our focus on equipping homes with smart thermostats, motion sensors, things of that nature, things that you can put on pool pumps and AC units and understand and predict. That's the other key piece of this, is utilizing AI and analytics to predict times when you're going to be away from your home when that coincides with super high energy prices.
Yeah, though that brings up an interesting, there's something we talked to Pablo Vegas at ERCOT about this past year or so. Whenever you get energy people in the room talking about AI, it's all about how do we build more power plants? How are we going to connect these data centers? How are we going to grow that? But I do want to talk about to the extent you can, how is NRG utilizing AI or learning from AI? And you've already kind of gotten there, but is there the way you're using it and you can talk about in either operations or in these kind of smart home applications?
Oh, okay. Well, that's a very layered and complicated question. I mean, one of our areas of secret sauce is our market operations team. We really understand. We look at everything from day ahead pricing to how things are going to be looking in the markets a year from now. So we use AI to do a lot of that predictive analytics for us and help shape how we can actually control our cost of goods, like how we control our COGS and how we can extend some of that benefit to our customers. And then, again, from the technology that we're continuously improving of all of the technology that we have in customers' homes, how do we make that smarter? How do we make it faster? How do we get data points that are really going to drive a difference when it comes to cost and that monthly bill?
Yeah, and I think if you draw a straight line from the Vivint acquisition to where we are today, there was criticism back then, right? And now I think that Energy is making the case that flexibility is really where the value will be moving forward with all the load growth that's coming, because that happened at a time where we really didn't have the load growth in place that we have now with data centers and AI. So can you speak to people poo-poo VPPs and flexibility, but we're talking about a 1-gigawatt virtual power plant. So how much of a role moving forward do you think flexibility will have in meeting the demand?
It's going to have to continue to play a huge role, right? And when we think about bringing on load, which is all the load that's coming into Texas, all the load that's coming into the US, whether it's hyperscalers, onshoring, other types of development, having a solution at every point of the value chain is going to be increasingly important. That's why we're building power. We're building 3 power plants in Texas right now. We're looking to partner with hyperscalers, and our point of view is like we're going to bring our own power to those deals, right? So we're going to solve for the load piece of it. And then the end use customer, what are those new technologies we can bring to them that are going to be easy, seamless, help control their usage, or whatever is valuable to them? But I do think it's going to be this all of the above approach. And because we have a point of entry at scale in every single part of the value chain, our customers are going to be the winners.
So around like the virtual power plant that allows for turning down loads, at homes and businesses and things like that, it seems like that could be paired with if a data center that wants to kind of run more or less kind of at a flat load, if you just need a little bit of flexibility, maybe the flexibility doesn't have to come from the data center, it can come from somewhere else. And so I was just wondering if that's part of the conversations that y'all are having.
I think certainly. I mean, our approach is very bespoke to the end use customer, and where our end use customers will be willing to provide some additional flexibility in terms of either load reduction or putting some of that power back onto the grid, I think will be up to those individual contracts, end use power purchase agreements we sign with our customers. I kind of back to making things very personalized to the customer need, even if it's a residential customer, mom and pop shop, or a hyperscaler.
If we step back and think about this moment in time, we're 5 years out from Winter Storm Uri. Certainly politically, energy had its moment in Texas. And now we're in this load growth moment. Where do you see the market heading here in Texas moving forward? Do you think that our state is open for business? Are we going to be able to meet the moment? I think a lot of folks are asking questions over at ERCOT and the Public Utility Commission, trying to figure out if we're going to have enough generation to meet the load, because the transmission takes time, right? It's not going to get built overnight. It's going to get built over the next 5 to 10 years. So what's NRG's perspective on this, and where do you see the markets heading?
Well, we used to think about power generation or power plant development in spans of 10, 15, 20 years. And now we're having to think about it in terms of 12 to 18 months. Our residential customers are thinking about it in 30-day increments, right? And so in Texas, the markets have worked, right? We did have a lot of issues during Winter Storm Uri, but they weren't market design issues per se, right? So these markets are designed to benefit, I think, all areas of the energy value chain. And so when we think about how we can scale up or scale down or meet the needs, because Texas is open for business, because permitting, interconnection, all of these things that really matter and can be some of those long lead times, we're going to be able to meet the needs of our customers. And we'll do that either through bringing on new generation, utilizing battery technology and other forms of storage. We still have the largest renewable state in the country, right? So we have all of these elements. And then when we bring solutions like 1 gig of VPP, that's 1 gig of electricity that's not needing to be put onto the poles and wires across the state.
So one of the things about looking at the horizons that different customers look at or different market participants look at, I mean, one of the things right now with the current events in the Middle East is, gasoline prices are high. And, there's a lot of talk about, well, if you want to be insulated from, gasoline prices, maybe just switch to an electric vehicle. I know it's probably a little too soon to see very much movement in that space, but like, how do you see the electrification of transportation with your customers moving forward?
Well, it's going to impact us twofold. One, more electrification is going to require more generation. It's going to
Right.
require more electrons created. But we are also going to be able to use those batteries in those electric vehicles to ease during times, maybe flow energy back, store energy. So I think it's going to be a complement to how we think about serving customers. In addition to smart home, EVs are part of a smart home. And so part of our strategy is to partner more with the EV companies, partner more with those third parties to figure out how we can continue to leverage those as a load resource.
Yeah, and the generation mix, like Josh just alluded to, has changed so much in the last 5 years. Like, it's pretty mind-blowing that you mentioned the role of renewables in Texas. I think it's about 90% of new generation since Winter Storm Uri has been wind, solar, and batteries. How do you see the grid here in Texas? I mean, when we hear from reporters, they look at Texas as like the blueprint for how you build out a really diversified grid. Would you agree with that? Do you think that it needs any tweaks or changes moving forward, making sure that we're a reliable and affordable grid?
Yeah, reliable and affordable. And reliable is a key piece of that as well, because we're going to have thermal load, because thermal load's going to be there when the wind or the solar is not performing as it can be on the highest peak days. And so having this great energy mix, I think one is what keeps prices pretty low in Texas compared to other parts of the country, and certainly helps us with the diversity of how we think about providing solutions to customers that meet their needs, adhere to their values.
So one of the things that's been talked about with some other folk from NRG is that, like, if oil stays high, then the chip supply for things like Vivint could be affected. As part of your portfolios, how are y'all game planning that?
Well, again, using AI
Yeah.
and thinking through our supply chain. And then also, if our costs are going up to put these components in people's homes, what are other ways where we can increase value? What are other ways where we can lower our costs? And so just being really thoughtful about how we balance across the entire value chain and portfolio of NRG. And one of the things that we want to figure out, if we're going to have to increase costs for a product or a service, how do we mitigate that with one of our other products or services? And I think the notion of saving money on your energy bill through enrolling in a VPP program is one of the ways that we can help mitigate some of those cost increase that we may need to adjust for a variety of reasons, whether it's inflation, whether it's not getting the chips through, or other increased cost in the value chain.
That's something that we talk about all the time on this podcast, is how important flexibility is and how undervalued it is sometimes in the market because of the transmission and really mostly distribution infrastructure that gets deferred because you have all this new flexibility. Can you speak to where the real value is and how we maybe unlock some of the value stack that maybe isn't quite available, at least in ERCOT, maybe in other markets where the utilities are more vertically integrated? But here, the fact that we have our utilities on one side, generators on the other, Gentailers like NRG, can you speak to maybe where some of the obstacles might lie and how we can unlock some of those parts of the value stack?
One way is just to increase the partnerships that we have across the energy stack. Let's partner more with the battery providers. Let's partner more with the solar providers. We announced a partnership with Sunrun a few months ago. So how do we get renewables into individual homes, right? So I think the value of partnerships is really one way to unlock some of the additional value for customers.
So one of the things I did a lot of my research on and was around for like Smart Grid 1.0 back in the early 2000s or whatever. And I remember there were a bunch of pilots and a bunch of things that went well and a bunch of things that didn't go so well. I was curious, y'all are trying a lot of things. Is there anything you've tried in the last couple of years that hasn't worked out as you would have expected it to?
I think scaling, you start with a pilot, you're like, this is a great idea. And then perhaps whatever pilot you've tried didn't scale. And I think that's one of our biggest lessons learned is how do we start things in a pilot phase, test them out, see what works, take a lot of learnings from that, and then either pivot or trash the idea, which I think that's also, in a bigger company, that maintaining that ability to be agile and flexible, that's one of the ways. Test the product service, see if it works. If it doesn't work, if customers don't love it, then we're not going to do it.
Yeah. Texas Energy Fund, we're a few years removed from, that would have been 2023 session that the Texas Energy Fund passed. Officially, Governor Abbott signed it into law. And the idea initially was try to get more dispatchable power out there on the grid. So from NRG's perspective, how are we doing on the TEF? Any progress being made or anything that folks should be aware of?
All right. Well, we're actively in construction on 3 projects, and one at TH Wharton is pretty far along, and we're bringing power to the grid in a very short order of time. And we did that by just making a bet. We placed our bets that we are going to be able to construct generation in the state of Texas in the near term. And so we had turbines available, we had labor available, we had all the necessary permits, everything that we needed to start construction immediately. And so for us, we're on track, on budget, and we'll be ready to put power on the grid.
One of the things that the hyperscalers, those that are building some of these large data centers, are kind of garnering some criticism for are around some of their environmental goals that seem to maybe be taking kind of a backseat to growth. Can you speak to NRG's kind of like sustainability goals and how those have needed to change, if anything, to kind of meet the challenge that we have today?
First and foremost is, our commitment to providing affordable energy to our customers, whether they're households or hyperscalers. And then also hyperscalers need to pay their part, right? So if we're going to build generation, we're not going to pass that cost on to small businesses, existing businesses, consumers. So the hyperscalers are going to have to come ready to pay their part in constructing that new generation. When you think about the natural resources, we're going to take that into account every time we construct anything. Even in our TEF projects, we're going to think about water, we're going to think about lands, we're going to think about the community, we're going to think about emissions. And it's no different when we're thinking about partnering with the hyperscalers. And, what I'll commit to today is every deal we do, there's going to be a community investment associated with it. I don't know what it's going to look like. Again, it'll be bespoke for where the plant is sited, what the conditions are, and what the community needs are. But community investment will be a really important part of every data center deal we do.
Yeah, that's great to hear and is so hard to build in general, right? Like transmission is hard to build, data centers are hard to build, community involvement is so important, I think, more than ever. And what we're hearing here at CERAweek has been a lot of BYO generation. That seems to be the buzz.
BYOP.
BYOP.
Bring your own power.
Is that kind of where NRG sees the market headed as far as data centers bringing their own power?
Absolutely. Yeah. And that is our key strategy, is bring your own power.
Mm-hmm.
Again, we want to make sure hyperscalers own their part in this, and then those costs and the unintended consequences aren't passed down to our consumers.
Mm-hmm.
Do we still need better messaging around that? Because there is a lot of angst around the cost of the infrastructure passing on to electricity. And I know there's a lot of the hyperscalers have come out with these pledges and things, and we're talking about bring your own power and the infrastructure and the community benefits. Is that getting through?
I don't know. I'd like to say that we're going to be able to change the narrative around it. But until we put one in the ground, until we prove ourselves, then I think we need to be held accountable. And if media or consumers or consumer protection agencies want to challenge us, they should. And it'll be up to us to deliver on our commitments and promises.
Yeah, because at the end of the day, folks see their bills going up and they may not know where all the chargers are coming from, even as savvy as our Texas customers are. And I think that messaging is so important because moving forward, this is the new boogeyman in town. For a while it was renewables. It seems like now data centers, and who knows who the next boogeyman will be. But I think you're right. The underlying message here is how do we help folks pay for their energy bills? How do we make things more affordable, right? At the same time, more reliable? It's a hard message to sell, but it's going to be really important, I think, over the next few years.
Yep, you're absolutely right. And again, we've got to show up. When we think about how we show up for our customers, how we build trust with our customers, they need to see it in their bills. We need to come through on the commitments we're making to them.
And I can't help but asking, since you talked about we got to put one of these things in the ground and kind of see how it goes. And if you don't want to answer this question, that's fine. But if you look at ERCOT's top level numbers for how much data centers and large loads, it's triple, quadruple. I think there's bigger numbers coming out. I'm shooting for 500 gigawatts because just why not? But companies like NRG have to build the power plant, have to build the power to be able to support that. And so, are you able to shed any light on what's reasonable? How fast can we actually grow?
That's a great question. On the timeline, I don't know. I think we need these in the ground, 2030s, right? If not before. We have the benefit of being uniquely positioned that we have 5.4 gigawatts of turbines.
Yeah.
So we're not going to wait on a turbine. We have an arrangement with Kiewit for labor. We're not going to wait on labor. So we have those commitments. We have a great regulatory team. We have a great environmental team. I feel confident that we're going to be able to move as quickly as we can, but we have all the right pieces in the right places.
Yeah. And at the end of the day in Texas, the ratepayer is not on the hook. Ultimately, it's the investor that's on the hook for generation, which is really different in other parts of the country, right? That's what we have in Texas that's very unique. And I think the three of us are all champions for this great market that we have.
That's right. That's back to that competition. Mm-hmm. Competition creates that innovation. It creates, I'm going to say this, the need for speed. Anyone old enough to remember that movie? And I think that competitive nature of the way that we do things here in Texas are going to help us get solutions on the ground faster.
Yeah, I was part of a roundtable with Columbia University the other day, and it was a third roundtable that they had kind of had. It was in Texas, and they had the other ones were in New York and Washington, D.C. And one of the immediate takeaways was like how much more positive the Texas people were about electricity growth and data centers and incorporating this. It wasn't a bad thing this is coming. We might not know exactly how it's going to work out, how it will work out, but we'll figure it out.
Yeah, I think in partnership with all of our stakeholders, we've created an environment that invites this type of development, that understands the needs for power, that understands the needs of our customers, and wants to really be that center of growth in the country, that center of innovation. And that's where I see a lot of the positivity coming through. And in Texas, it just seems like there's a little less uncertainty about how we're going to get it done. Yeah. I think that should provide a lot of confidence, not just our customers, but also to our shareholders.
Yeah, and the track record is there as far as how we built a robust grid over the past few decades. I think, there's no state better than Texas as far as
that's right.
Who's built out a grid that can actually handle all this load growth.
And there have been a lot of lessons learned, too. We've hardened infrastructure. We've learned to winterize, which really wasn't a Texas thing several years ago. And then we've evolved our thinking, too. And we also move, I think, at a faster pace.
Gin Kinney, thanks for coming on the Energy Capital podcast.
Thanks so much, Jen. Thanks for spending time with us today. Appreciate it.
All right.
Absolutely. Hey, everyone. That was our discussion with Gin Kinney from NRG, filmed at CERAweek. And this is kind of a discussion after that. It's been a couple weeks since CERAweek. And so Matt and I are here to kind of talk a little bit about that conversation, as well as some other things that have happened that were talked about at CERAweek and things that have happened since then. Hey, Matt, how's it going?
Hey, Josh. I'm doing well. How are you doing?
Doing good. I actually just got back from London, so I'm a little jet lagged right now. So if I say anything that doesn't make sense, I'm just going to blame it on that.
Okay. Right? So for you, it's what, like 2 o'clock in the morning right now?
Yeah, I don't know what time zone I'm in. Whatever. So one of the things we talked about with Jen was about their VPP, about their virtual power plant. Remind me how NRG is structuring that.
Yeah, sure. So for folks who may not know what a VPP is, it's a virtual power plant. Some folks are calling it a distributed power plant, a DPP. So the acronym kind of depends on who you talk to. But NRG announced this years ago. And essentially what it is an aggregation of smart thermostats for all of its retail customers in Reliant that sign up for this program. They're essentially opting into this new virtual power plant program. So they'll be seeing discounts on their bills for participating. And NRG has projected about a gigawatt as far as the growth potential of the virtual power plant. I think the target year was about 2035, if I'm not mistaken.
Okay, so we got a bit of runway before we get there. Do you know how this differs from other smart thermostat programs? I remember I'm in Austin Energy, and I know Austin Energy has had multiple iterations of smart thermostat programs. Even before you had the smart Nest and Honeywell thermostats, Austin Energy had this thermostat controlled by radio frequency. And so they would just send out a high frequency AM, I don't know if it was AM or FM or even either one of those, but they would send out some kind of signal somehow and all these thermostats would just drop off. And so it was one-way communication. Anyways, do you know how this one differs in terms of how it's interacting with the ERCOT market?
Yeah, well, the idea obviously is to aggregate and bid into the market, right? So similar to what we're seeing in the ADER program. And I thought that when we interviewed Pablo a few weeks ago, that was a really interesting part of the conversation, right? Because there's a lot of potential out there. He referred to it as almost like an Airbnb or an Uber platform for virtual power, which I thought was interesting, right?
Yeah.
I think the biggest difference, Josh, is that this is a Gentailer that's running the VPP, right? Which is really unique if you compare it to like an Austin Energy, which is vertically integrated, or some other states that are running these programs, right? Like the example that comes to mind right now, because it's so newsworthy, is this new special contract in Michigan that Google is currently negotiating with DTE, with the utility up there, and mostly renewable build out with some demand response included in the proposal. So it's really interesting to see moving forward with all this load growth, what role demand response and virtual power plants are going to play, right? Of like, you can put some numbers to it. Like in this case, we're talking about a gigawatt potentially of demand response. So that once you get into the gigawatt numbers, I think ERCOT takes that seriously and starts thinking about how big of a role it could play in grid reliability.
One of the things about turning something like these types of aggregations, to get those, like something has to be on before you can turn it off, right? The thing like different between like an aggregation of smart or distributed appliances and things is an appliance has to be consuming energy. Say an air conditioner consuming 5 kilowatts, turn it off for a little bit of time to get that 5 kilowatts versus like a battery that's sitting there that you're able to turn something on. In my head, I've always put them in kind of different buckets. You know, we've seen like in the ADER program, the ones that have actually moved forward or that have been more successful early on have been more kind of the battery side of things, because maybe utilities or maybe the aggregators see them as more better sense of the capacity that they'll have.
I think you're right. I think that to really break this down, like VPPs are the orchestrators of distributed energy versus a traditional demand response program, which is just about changing consumption behavior, right? Like just getting into the way that we consume energy and trying to reduce that peak load. I do think that VPPs are exciting moving forward because they're so local, like the ADER program in Texas being a great example. If they're able to target specific substations and actively work to lower peak load at that substation, then it will make a significant difference, right? And like in those specific, we call them nodes, but in those nodal areas where we know that the substations are being overloaded. So I think there is a lot of potential there as far as not necessarily a traditional demand response model, but virtual power plant that has the effect of, you know, flicking a switch and turning on a virtual power plant.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense. One of the other things we talked a little bit about with Jen, but we also like heard a lot talked about at other panels in CERAweek is, you know, all the stuff still going on in NRN, right? There were people who were talking about like how long it was going to last. You know, as we're recording this a couple of weeks later, it's, you know, still going on. To me, it's unclear how much is moving through or if anything is kind of moving through, although oil prices are still high. They're talking about, you know, rationing jet fuel and things like that in Europe. It's still a pretty big issue. And the price of gasoline is high. When you were there and listening to other panels and other things like that, do you think people had a feel for what was happening, or do you think that they figured it was going to keep going this long?
I don't think anybody did, right? At least you and I and most normal people who may not be in the weeds on this stuff. But I thought it was interesting at CERAweek to hear, obviously the shareholders are paying attention, right? So when companies go to CERAweek and they speak about load growth and data centers and the war in Iran and gas prices and all of the above, it tends to lean towards like overstatements, and it's hard to distill really like what's true and what will take shape in the markets versus how much of this is hyperbole. So like I would actually flip that question back onto you, Josh, because I feel like you're more qualified to answer it than I am. Like you're coming at this from a much more academic and scientific point of view. And we've had a lot of conversations on this podcast about the load growth numbers and how inflated or not inflated they are. But what's your latest feeling on this? You think that we're in for a bit of a cooling period as far as the numbers are concerned?
I think I learned pretty early on not to really opine on federal policy when it comes to some of these things. Sometimes it's hard to see what is going on. I mean, if we zoom back down into Texas, like looking at the numbers around electricity and load growth and other types of things like that, I wouldn't say they make any more sense, but I mean, at least we might have a better handle on that. I mean, I think some of the latest numbers coming out of, you know, ERCOT in terms of large loads are now even larger. I think some of the latest numbers I saw was like 410 gigawatts of large loads coming to the system. And so that, again, we're an 85.5 gigawatt load. And so you're talking about, you know, a 5x of the grid in the next few years. I mean, it's not going to happen. There's no way that the system can grow that fast. Even like 20%, if I'm doing the math right in my head, of the expected large load is like doubling the grid, right? It's pretty insane. You know, it's easy to look at the numbers and think like there's no way, you know, that kind of thing could happen. I was driving through the Hutto, like kind of Taylor area a few weeks ago. And, there are some of these things being built. I mean, there's some massive data centers and things like that being built out that way. I thought I was actually coming up on the Samsung plant, but then I realized I wasn't even in Taylor yet. And I was in Hutto, driving past a huge data center and a whole bunch of nat gas gen, that's coming along with it.
Yeah, and like not to mention the impact of Austin being surrounded by data centers and what that will bring in the future. But to your point, Josh, this is also happening across the country. Like the Michigan example that I mentioned, that's a 2.7 gigawatt contract in a state that has like 20 gigawatts of summer peak load. So sometimes the numbers aren't as eye-popping in other states, but proportionately, it's the same effect, right? It's like, how do you grow your grid exponentially that quickly? The thing about the numbers that you just mentioned from the ERCOT, like the most recent numbers,
Yeah.
is that we had that bill HB 5066 a couple years ago on the Permian Basin. So, people forget that changed the way that we do regional transmission planning
Right.
forecasts, right? Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that's where the numbers are coming from as far as utilities providing those numbers and then ERCOT being forced to adjust them based on their own projections.
Yeah, no, it did. I mean, it basically, ERCOT had to consider all unsigned load, like in planning processes. But then we had SB6 that also said, you've got to say whether or not you're shopping this around and things like that. But yet the numbers keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And so I don't know about you. It was like 410. Like I was shooting for 500. Like I was really hoping it's going to be 500. I am still kind of confused, right? I mean, how much of it to believe or what else? Because I thought that was going to have a little bit more clarity into the system, but the numbers just keep jumping up higher and higher and higher. I mean, ERCOT has their adjusted load forecast, which is lower, but I mean, it's still a pretty significant increase.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And you feel for some of the decision makers, like when we came away from the interview with Pablo, they're put in a really tough spot, right? Because if you're ultimately the grid operator and you have to plan for all this loading, some of it isn't going to materialize, then you're put in a really hard spot. And I think the same could be said about the Public Utility Commission, right? Because they're trying to they want economic development, they want economic growth, but at the same time, you can't build out for load that may not materialize. So the number is somewhere in the middle, but at this point, I think it's anyone's guess how much we actually end up with.
Yeah, I actually ran these numbers the other day, just using ERCOT's long-term load forecast and other types of things. And I compared it to like what we used to do, particularly for our like own grid modeling purposes. If you took like historical data and then kind of projected, forward based on that, just looking at peak demand, if you take, the past few years of growth and you look at like say 2030, you're at about 100 gigawatts in terms of ERCOT in the grid. So between the next 4 or 5 years, like, we gain another 15 gigawatts, which is in line with kind of how traditionally we would have, thought the system to grow. If you look at, so ERCOT's adjusted load forecast is about 140, about 40 gigs more of that. And then if you take the additional TSP, like, all the unsigned load, it's like 210 or something like that, which is a pretty big difference. It's like historically what we would have seen to be about 100 and then the high line number being double of that. One of the interesting thing is this time period between like now and 2031-ish or so, where you just see this massive change in load growth. And then it kind of flattens back out again. Actually, it grows, but then it grows at a more reasonable path. But the next few years are going to be pretty darn interesting. And the answer is probably somewhere in the middle.
Yeah. Well, what do you think about this topic that we kept hearing at CERAweek, which is, don't worry, we'll bring our own generation, right? Because we heard a lot of that in Houston.
Yeah.
And I know some of it is true. Like, absolutely, some of these data centers are doing that. But
yeah,
what I hear most from experts is the cheapest electron typically comes from the grid, right? That's not going to come from bringing your own generation. So, like, where do you see that landing as far as these data centers coming with their own generation?
I don't believe that these data center companies, these hyperscalers, want to be in the power business. And I've listened to a few other podcasts with like some other folks from, some of the big ones like, Meta and Microsoft and other places. Like they've even said that, right? That they like don't really want to be in the power gen business. One, because the margins are much lower than they're used to expecting, right? It's not like they're getting into this like they're trying to make money. The margins are single digit margins versus like the double digit margins or triple digit margins, depending on who you are, that you're used to. So this is not an attractive business, for them to be in. It's like out of necessity that they're trying to. And even some of like the conversations that I've heard, it's like they're not even trying to do this in the long run, right? It's just like if you're measuring like every megawatt of data center that's not operational in the billions of dollars lost like every year, that's a pretty big incentive to like try to get your data center going like as fast as possible. So you're hearing a lot of things like bridge power and other types of stuff. Like we want to be on the grid, but we want to start generating tokens. Tokens being like the answer that the AI models give you, like every word or letter or piece of code being a token. We want to be generating these tokens based on the models that we've trained. We need to, because that's how we make money, right? But it's hard, right? Because like you're competing for the same assets. Supply chains can grow, and we can have other companies that build these power plants can increase and grow, but they can only grow so fast. And like I was just looking at the ERCOT data, it's like the next 5 years are key, right? In terms of how many data centers and how they want to connect these supply chains, they can't grow that fast. And so you're seeing some really wild things out there when it comes to like how these data centers are going to be powered. There's a big data center, roughly a 350 megawatt data center going up outside of El Paso that's going to be powered by something like 800 small units that are like 450-ish, kilowatts each. But that's like the only way that they're able to get power, to that region. And then there's something going on at the, Public Utility Commission about how, those assets will eventually transfer over to El Paso Electric, like rate base or something like that. I don't fully understand how it's all set up. But in general, stringing together a whole bunch of like really small things to power a big thing, it's like a symptom of like the thing that they actually want, which would be to connect to the grid, is not available. The secondary thing that they want, which would be, a multi-hundred megawatt power plant, is not available. And like there's no other option, right? You're going to go with 800 really small things with a whole bunch of moving parts. To me, that sounds like a logistics nightmare when it comes to maintaining these things and keeping things operational.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there will be a wave of co-located solar and batteries. I think we're already seeing it for a lot of these data centers. But I think you're right. For the most part, this is like plan B for them, right? If they had another option, they would just connect to the grid as soon as possible. But it's all about speed to power, right? They're all just trying to get connected as quickly as possible. And we've had a couple of legislative hearings since we were at CERAweek in Houston. So I wanted to get your thoughts on that. My takeaway really was like, I think SB6 is just the beginning of legislation around data centers and transmission cost allocation and all this stuff. It sounds like there's going to be more coming from the Capitol next year. But what was your primary takeaway from those hearings?
I mean, yeah, this is a problem we've like never really had before, right? It's hard to plan for what you don't know or have processes in place for what you don't know. Just an example, I was talking to one TSP a couple months ago.
I bet it feels like a couple years.
I know. Everything in this space feels like a couple years ago. I was talking to one TSP a couple months ago, and they said that in the previous years, they might have had like one large load study going on per year. But at that point, they had like 100 going on at the same time. The system was not designed to handle that. And this is why ERCOT's going this batch zero process that, Pablo talked about. It's because we have a generator interconnection queue, and there's like a very well understood process upon which, a generator moves from a dream to making electricity. When we talk about this large load interconnection queue, like we actually had a process, there wasn't really a process in place. This plane took off, and then we're trying to build it as it's, going off, it's going in the air. And it had taken off and it was already over the Atlantic Ocean by the time we figured out like we needed to build it, right? I think there's going to be a lot of policies and protocols and like things that we're going to have to figure out. And we're not going to get it perfect. I mean, I think we'll do it better in Texas than they do in other regions. Other regions are just, I think Maine recently just put in just a straight up moratorium on things and saying, no, we're not going to build anything here. I think Texas is going to, try to build as much as we can because that's what we do. But yeah, we're going to have to figure this out. And we're going to have to figure out who pays for it, right? It's one thing for that load to grow at like a steady clip that supply chains are used to handling. But if it grows many, 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 many times faster, classic supply and demand means prices go up. We're going to have to figure out how do we make sure that, those that are putting the new stress on the system are the ones that are, bearing the cost of that.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think some of that the PUC is working out right now through these rulemakings around SB6. It's not perfect, but like you said, we're kind of out front and center on this issue in a way that other states are not. Like other states are just starting to ask those questions and we're already implementing legislation. So I do see that we're at least a year and a half ahead of most other states. The question is just like, how does the PUC implement those rules?
Yeah.
And then what's missing heading into the next legislative session, right? We're like in this big kind of uncertain territory right now.
Yeah, I mean, even companies will tell you like they prefer policy certainty, even if the policy's bad, because then you can just work around that. Policy uncertainty is like something that it's the worst.
I hear that all the time. Our companies are like, just tell us where the goalposts are and stop moving them. That's all that they want. They're just looking for a certainty, for sure.
Yeah. And that's what Pablo said when we talked to him the other day, right? He was just like, we're going to implement. He was talking about something else, but he's like, we just got to get going and then we'll, make it better as we do, which I think is smart.
And also, Josh, there's always a reason to go past more bills because Winter Storm Uri was the perfect reason, right? But then there's always something happening. So now we've got the data center boom. We've got more legislation coming out of Austin.
Yeah.
Which just begs the question of like, when is enough legislation and maybe just time to let the market do its thing?
No, I totally. I mean, like, bless their hearts, but the Texas legislators, they're not electricity experts. It's a citizen legislature, right? I think it's best done when they set, high level goals and trajectories and like let the Public Utility Commission has electricity experts sitting on the dais or as in the staff and all the other folks, let them do the job of, taking that broad policy direction and converting that into workable statutes and things like that. And then let ERCOT convert those into protocols that actually are govern how the market's structured. I think the ledge got a little too prescriptive after Winter Storm Uri because they wanted to feel like that they were doing something. I mean, I feel that, but it's like, if you get too prescriptive, it becomes harder to work in the system, right? The more prescriptive you are starting like higher up the chain, like the less flexibility that the Public Utility Commission has to maneuver. And then, the less that ERCOT does. And like, because we probably need the maximum amount of like flexibility and maneuverability, I would hope we don't legislate as, strict or as granular as we did after Uri.
Yeah, I think you're totally right. I think like, we don't want the legislature creating new ancillary services, for example. That should be ERCOT's job. And to your point, Josh, I think that this is the best version of the PUC and ERCOT that I've seen since I started in this role. They're extremely competent and very smart and just have a ton on their plates right now, right? So like the best thing that the legislature could do would be just let them do their jobs and give them some time to work out all these different rulemakings, because right now they're just trying to catch up, get up to speed with all the statutory deadlines.
Yeah.
They don't have time to take on additional work that maybe ideally they'd like to be working on other things, but they just got to get through all these different deadlines that are on their plates right now.
Yeah, totally. All right, thanks everyone. That wraps up the post conversation with Matt. Big thanks to NRG and Jen for being available and chatting during CERAweek. It was great and looking forward to seeing y'all next time. If today's conversation helped you make better sense of how the energy system actually works, share the episode with a colleague and hit follow on your podcast app. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and all the usual platforms. For deeper analysis and context each week, subscribe to the Texas Energy Empower at texasenergyempower.com. That's where you'll find every episode, every article, and our latest updates. We're also on LinkedIn, X, and YouTube, where we share clips, insights, and ongoing commentary on energy policy, markets, and the grid. Before we go, a quick note. The views expressed on this podcast are my own and do not represent the official positions of the University of Texas, Idea Smiths, Austin Energy, or Columbia University. A big thanks to Nate Peavy, our producer. I'm Joshua Rhodes. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.